ones that flood all the time. And University Mall across the street didn't exist. That was an empty field for you younger folks. And luckily we moved there instead of Glen Lennox because we had lots of friends in Glen Lennox. We didn't know anybody in Camelot, but they had a swimming pool. And in Camelot, we met the nicest bunch of folks, one of which is our speaker today. He was working on his PhD. We sent a little bit of his CV out, but next week you'll get his full CV because he's a genius. But he's the first person in his immediate family to graduate, to finish the 4th grade. His grandfather had no education. His father did make it through the 4th grade. And Gary has a PhD from Carolina, undergraduate from Millikan. The part that won't be in his CV is when he was taking his wife, Lynn, before they were married, to meet his family and then her family. And his family, his grandfather had come into Napoleonville, Louisiana to cut sugarcane, 1906. And then his father ended up in Wood River, Illinois, which is famous as where the Lewis and Clark expedition outfitted their boats. And so it's an Italian enclave there. And he's taking Lynn to meet his family, and the next day they're going to go meet Lynn's family on the other side of Illinois from a farm family. Well, when they pull in, his uncles come out with mirrors on sticks, and they're looking under his car for bombs. It turns out one of his uncles had been shot the week before in a little Italian turf war, and they couldn't be too safe. Then they went the next night to see Lynn's parents, and they're sitting at the dining room table, and her daddy has a rifle leaning on the table. And Gary didn't know if that was for him or not. And right in the middle of the meal, Lynn's dad yanks up the rifle and fires it out the window. It turns out he had gophers that he was trying to get rid of. Of course, Gary thought he had been shot when this all happened. But this is the part you don't get in a CV. And Gary has had an incredible career and basically the chaired professor of Florida history. And we hope we can get his PowerPoint working. Will Bunch is going to try to make it go. But here is my good buddy, Gary Mormino.
Delighted to join you.
There it is.
I can't express how much Chapel Hill means to me and my family. Some of you may know our daughter, Rebecca, works at the Keenan School of Business at UNC. She was a graduate of UNC. I'm going to talk today about World War II. It's a topic that has always fascinated me. It's personal and professional. I wish I had a survey of the audience. I'm guessing most of the audience had a father or grandfather who were World War II vets. When I ask my students these days, it's generally their great-grandfather, if they know at all. But World War II was a transforming event, and tomorrow is the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. VJ Day, Victory Japan, happiest day in American history. Historians generally are ridiculed because we only talk about tragedy and sadness, but today is a joyous talk about some of the memorable characters I've known. I'm about to come out with a book on World War II, and I've interviewed hundreds of people. So would you advance the first slide, please? This would give you an idea of what World War II meant to North Carolina and Florida. So on the eve of Pearl Harbor, North Carolina had almost twice as many inhabitants as Florida. Florida was the smallest state in the American South, a population smaller than South Carolina or Arkansas. And look, advanced, that should be 2020, by the way, 2020. Florida has double the population of North Carolina. We're the third largest state in the Union, and it's in many ways because of World War II. World War II was the linchpin separating the state that was far away. It was lightly settled. It was definitely a southern state. Today, I don't think many listeners would call Florida a southern state. Advance, please. Next slide. So here's an excellent illustration of how one World War II vet can make a difference. And it's not John Kennedy, although it also tells you that World War II was a war that everyone participated in. So here you have the son of the ambassador of the court of St. James. 3 of the Kennedy brothers will be fighting. 1 will die in the war. And Sam Gibbons, not of working class parentage, but a Tampan. And Sam Gibbons is probably most famous as a congressman from 1962 to the late 90s. But he was one of several thousand Americans who parachuted on December the 5th, 1944, behind enemy lines. Talk about a harrowing experience. He, in his backpack were 2 cans of Schlitz beer. Schlitz later wanted to do an endorsement, but he would not do it. But the point I'm making here is, today, I think UNC has 20-something thousand people today. Sam Gibbons is the father of the University of South Florida, where I teach. We have 49,000 students. One person founded. I've just been corrected. UNC has 30,000 people. Next, please. World War II began really in several waves. The war in Asia was already underway. Japan had conquered China, was advancing on other places. But on September 1st, 1939, Germany attacks Poland from the west, Russia from the east, and that is the official beginning of World War II as we know it. And in fact, for several years, they didn't know what to call this war. Only in around 1941 was it called World War II. There obviously World War I was known as the Great War. Look at that banner headline, by the way. You'll probably never see, many of you will never see a paper again, but this was the golden age of journalism. Next, please. Only surpassed, back one, please. Only surpassed by this banner headline. I talked to the guy who set the press for the St. Petersburg Times, and he told me he thought something big was going to happen, so he was preserving the red ink on the occasion. Next, please. Some of the best stories I've heard have to do with what were you doing on Pearl Harbor. But this will give you an idea of the magnitude of World War II. This is somber. September 1st, 1939 was the first day of a war that would last 2,174 days, and it brought the first dead of a conflict that would claim 27,600 lives every single day, 1,150 every hour, 19 a minute, 1 death every 3 seconds. And then yesterday, some of you may have seen the headline that there are still 1 million Japanese war dead whose remains have never been uncovered. Think of the mothers, the fathers, grandfathers. This is just a terrible war in terms of human toll. Next, please. My favorite Pearl Harbor story involves 2 people. The man on the left, his name was Solomon Fleischman, but he went by the nickname Salty Saul because he was a radio. I got to know him when he was a TV sports commentator, and he always wore the sailor hat. But on December the 7th, 1941, he is atop the tallest building in Tampa, Florida, conducting a CBS radio hour. Kate Smith is singing God Bless America, and the voice of John Daly comes on. We now interrupt this program, and John Daly announces, it's a very cryptic message. No reporter is at Pearl Harbor, but he says, planes with Japanese markings were seen to be strafing the fields of Oahu, he pronounced it. And he has no idea what the hell just happened. And so he puts it on pilot and goes down to get a sandwich. And a Jeep just pulls up to the Tampa Terrace Hotel, and the Jeep is bringing Major General Clarence Tinker, the commander of MacDill Army Airfield. Tinker is also an Osage Indian who has become, even though as an Indian, he can't cash his check because of too long reasons. But anyway, Tinker asked Salty, he said, Salty, have you heard any news? And Fleischman says, well, I just heard this announcement about Japanese planes at Oahu. And Tinker spits out his coffee and said, son, this means war. And the Jeep pulls away. Next, please. 6 months later, he's now General Clarence Tinker, is the first American general to die in World War II. He has been dispatched to Midway. His B-17 was missing. They've never recovered the body. And it gets even wearier. His son, to avenge his father's death, is also killed in the South Pacific. Next, please. So how the fate of history. So look at the guy at the left. I mean, this breaks your heart. If you read that, he was an orphan. His sister was an orphan, and he left the orphanage, I think, at age 17 to join the Marines. He's killed at Okinawa. The fate of history. My father was at Okinawa and survived, but the role of history is strange. So to me, the war is personal and professional. My father dropped out of 4th grade. To him, World War II was the greatest adventure in his life. He was a fighting CB, was a construction battalion. Next, please. Think of that. So Ross Anthony Mormino and Daniel Green volunteered for the war, but also the Kennedy brothers. And the brother on the right, Joseph Kennedy, John Kennedy first wins, I think, the Navy Cross through very heroic action. His PT boat is cut in half in the Solomon Islands, and he saves his crew. It ruins his back forever. So Joe is kind of embarrassed. The young brother wins all the medals, so Joe volunteers what only can be described as a suicide mission. He's to glide. He's flying a B-24 attached to a plane loaded with dynamite that is to blast away German positions on the French side. And his plane simply explodes. The dynamite exploded in the other plane. Body was never recovered. He was going to be the first Irish Catholic president in American history. The mantle goes to John, who was kind of the immature brother, the unhealthy brother. Next. The war also brings future presidents. To Chapel Hill came Gerald Ford and George Herbert Walker Bush, but also to Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station in Florida came George Herbert Walker Bush. Remarkable. Think about this. When you're 18 and you're headed to Yale, your father's about to become a U.S. senator from Connecticut, and he tells his family he's going to be the first in his family not to go to Yale, but instead he's going, after high school, going to join Navy Air. And he does, and is shot down in the South Pacific. He's the youngest naval aviator to be rescued flying a PT boat. Or actually, it's a PT Avenger. Next, please. One of the second best Pearl Harbor story I heard. So I got to know William Allen Emerson. If anyone out there is a University of Florida grad, the largest building on the University of Florida Gainesville campus is Emerson Hall, named after him. But in 1941, he's a St. Petersburg guy who's very poor. He's working 4 jobs in Gainesville. One of them is to deliver laundry, and that gives him wheels. And on the afternoon of December the 7th, 1941, he's parking with a girlfriend at the duck pond. and John Daly comes on. He takes the girlfriend back, sleeps at the county courthouse outside so he can enlist the next day. Fast forward, it's the end of the war. He's in occupied Tokyo, and he wants to bring his fiancée back a kimono. He goes into a Japanese tea house. They bring out a variety of kimonos, and he said, I'll take that one. He said he did not realize he bought the woman as well as the kimono, and said, no. But when he's back in Pensacola, he sees an old classmate. Her name is Jane. He's married to Barbara. She's engaged to another guy in St. Petersburg. He said, I'll give you a lift back. You know the rest of the story. By the time they got back, they were engaged and married, I think, 70 years. Next. World War II is a race war. It's the South is a very segregated place. This is one of the more heroic figures I've ever met. Robert Saunders. He was a son of West Indian immigrants to Tampa, living in an integrated neighborhood. Only in Tampa, Florida, Ybor City area, could you find that, the very fluid place. But he tells me he's at Bethune-Cookman College on December the 7th, 1941. He's a football player, which means, he said, he had to do dishes Sunday afternoon while Mary McLeod Bethune conducted a chapel. She was an imposing woman, about 6'2", daughter of slaves. And he's the first to hear about Pearl Harbor because he's doing dishes. No one interrupts Mary McLeod Bethune. So he writes out a note, what he just heard, sheepishly goes up, and she stares balefully at him, and he hands her the note, and she asks the men's and women's choir to get up. She tells them what happened, and they sing Climbing Jacob's Ladder. And the women answered, Do I think you'll be a soldier? He graduates, he survives the war, comes back, replaces Harry T. Moore in 1950 as the field secretary of the NAACP. Harry T. Moore and his wife, on Christmas Eve, 1950, their home was blown up by dynamite by the Klan. And Robert Saunders became a civil rights hero. Next. Look, can you imagine this headline? If you'll read the fine print, the children were all physicians. I've been trying to track down the family. I think they all moved out of Tampa, but and the father was a corporal in World War I. Next, please. How many of you know Colin Kelly? I'm waiting. If this were August 1942, ministers would be telling you, we will never forget Colin Kelly. He was the first hero of World War II, a Floridian from Madison, North Florida, a West Point grad. He's in Manila when the Japanese invade the Philippines. What we heard was that he managed to get his crew in the air. He was the pilot. They were badly shot up. The crew bailed out, but he guided his B-17 into the Japanese destroyer, the Haruna. That's not what happened. We needed a hero. They didn't exactly make up the story, but they embellished it. He did heroically ensure his crew's safety, and he was simply shot down. But he is the first great hero. And in Harlem, there is a West Indian immigrant by the name of Colin Powell, who changes the pronunciation of his name to Colin Powell because of Colin Kelly. Next. Greatest man I ever knew, Braulio Alonso. I mean, think of that. Who's the greatest man you ever knew? This on the left, Braulio Alonso was born in Tampa, early 1920s, I believe, son of Spanish immigrants. Rather devout. Most of the Spanish and Italian immigrants in Ybor City were anti-clerical, but he is a brilliant young student. All of his life, he wanted to be a doctor. So he graduates from, he's valedictorian in his class, but decides not to go to the University of Florida because he's making too much money in an illegal casino in Ybor City and making more than his father. And in 1941, he's drafted. We have the first peacetime conscription. And he figures, 60 days won't be long. 60 days turned into 4 years. He enters as a private, exits as a major. What would you think you'd be doing on June the 5th, 1944? So everyone knows about D-Day. June the 5th, the Allies took Rome. He was there when they took Rome. What would you guess most GIs would be doing that night? Looking for an Italian señorita, having a good time. He's very devout. He promised his mother, if he's in Italy, he's going to see the Pope. So he commands a Jeep. He and I think 9 other GIs go to the Vatican, and they go up to a Swiss guard. They were dressed like this in 1944. He said, "May I have an audience with Pope Pius XII, please?" And of course, the guy says, "Buzz off, get out of here." And he goes back to his Jeep. He gets a carton of cigarettes, nylons, and chocolates. He returns, and the Swiss guard said, "I misunderstood your question. Wait here." Believe it or not, 10 minutes later, Swiss guards accompanies him to a small room. A very frail Pope Pius XII comes, dresses them in halting English, and gives each of them a rosary. At the end of the war, he is in northern Italy, the Dolomites, fighting the Germans. He's leading a platoon of black soldiers. And a German general comes to him and offers him his baton to surrender. He hated the Germans so much for what they did by delaying the war. He admired his black troops so much, he had the general surrender to his black troops. And he said, "What a master race you are now." Next. By the way, a high school is named after Braulio Alonso. The second greatest man I ever knew was Andrew Hines. He's still alive. So imagine in 4 years going from all county athlete at Alachua High in Florida to a bombardier, or actually he was a navigator, and he, jaunty. His second mission, bombing Romanian oil fields, his plane is shot down, and he had never had parachute practice. They concluded your chances of dying the first time in a parachute jump is as great as your 40th time. And he wondered whether this thing would open. And sure enough, it opens. He lands on an island in the Danube. And a Hungarian hunter came, captured him, turned him over to the Germans. Next, please. He spends almost 4 years in German prisoner of war camps. The Russians are driving them westward. Here's his German POW card. Look, with the mustache. He looks like a young Brad Pitt, doesn't he, on the left? And next, please. By the way, I had Andrew Hines come to my World War II class probably a dozen times. In his early 90s, he was still speaking in complete paragraphs. Extraordinary. While he was a POW, he kept a diary. He managed to hammer out, you can see on the left, that's the copper kind of book plates for it. And on the back of Chesterfield cigarette packs, he wrote. And we now have the diary at the museum. And his one experience, he said he thought he was going to die in January, February 1945. It's bitterly cold, one of the coldest German winters. Battle of the Bulge had just ended. The Germans are despondent and everything's chaotic. And he said that's the worst time for a POW is when you're and they're constantly transferring the new cars. He said he thought he was going to starve to death or freeze to death. He had a single bouillon cube. And he notices at a crossing, a German peasant woman has a cauldron of hot water, and she's pouring it into the metal canteens. And he goes up and she's about to pour the water, and an SS officer comes up with a gun to her head. And he says, "Why are you helping the enemy?" And she said, "My son is a prisoner in America, and I hope someone's being nice to him." He survived. Next. World War II also, for the first time, prosperity pervades the South. Franklin Roosevelt, when he was elected as late as 1939, talked about the South as the #1 economic problem in America. Even tobacco farms, citrus, everything is booming in the South. Next. Remember, I was talking about Mary McLeod Bethune. So she's the only Black woman at a Daytona Chamber of Commerce meeting. And in 1942, the director of the Chamber of Commerce saying, "What are we going to do? We're a tourist economy with no tourists. We're going to roll up like a tar ball. No one's going to come." There are also tar balls on the beach because of German U-boat activity. And he asked, "Doesn't anyone know anyone in Washington?" And Mary McLeod Bethune leaves the room, calls her best friend, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the next day Daytona has a WAC base. At the beginning of World War II, Florida had about 20 military installations. By the end of the war, we had 200. I think North Carolina had 100. Some of these are mega bases. And I went up, I think in 1990, and interviewed about 20 women Army Corps veterans. Next, please. And this was one of them. The next woman, I found her grave. And of course, she married an officer there. But it was fascinating to talk to the women. Many of them were college grads. They all said everyone was fascinated with their uniforms. They got a lot of attention, as you might imagine, during the war. They're kind of the unsung heroes of the war. Next. If I could go back in a time machine, I would go to Tampa, 1943, at the Tampa shipyards. Tampa shipyards are booming. They can't get enough men to work there because of the draft. And women invade the shipyards. Look at that. Wouldn't you love to know what happened to those women? What were their undanced dreams? And in 2000, I had a friend who worked at the Tampa Tribune, and he put a little blurb in his column that this Saturday, if any women who worked at the Tampa shipyards would like to meet a historian working on that, please come to the University of South Florida Library. We had 90 women show up. Many of them brought their union cards. One of them grew up on a farm in Florida. She said she was a lady, even though she was working on the farm. She had never worn jeans until she became a welder. Now, these were Joans of Arc, not well, it escapes me. Rosie the Riveters. They were using welding art guns. Next, please. Ladies, how many of you have ever received a love letter like this? This is a proper love letter. So I met this artist who, this is actually his wife, by the way, not a girlfriend, but there are hundreds, if not thousands of these. Each letter postcard would come with this incredible artwork. Next. In
4 minutes.
Okay, in St. Petersburg, let's go the other ones. I'm going to roll through them. But there was a bombardier group. These were unmarried teenagers. You had to be interviewed and accepted, and you got to dance with the soldiers. And the ones I interviewed all told me we soon got to recognize the importance of the military tags and chevrons. Next. World War I was a war of firsts. The first woman, in this case, the first woman butcher in Tampa, Florida, with the irresistible name Ines Pecorino. Tell me that's not a great name. Next. the only woman in the 1943 Florida legislature. There were no Republicans. No, there was one Republican, one woman, no African Americans, no Hispanics, and she passed the Women's Emancipation Bill. Next. Frank Hurley. So the end of World War II. What was Frank Hurley doing August 15th, 1945? So I asked him, he said, I'm at Okinawa. My father's at Okinawa. He said, you won't believe this. He said, I was in my tent reading Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars. He said, only later did the irony dawn upon me. He said, an aunt heard that soldiers were acquiring bad habits in the Navy. So she thought I should read some proper books. And that's what he came back, became a multimillionaire land developer in Paso Grill. I bet some of you have vacationed in Paso Grill. Next. I don't think we have many more, but tell me that is not a manly man. Philip Fatalitas, I interviewed him. During the war, he was a frogman, blowing up German installations along the French border. Dangerous work. When he returned to Tarpon Springs, he was a diver. Tell me that's not as dashing a picture as you have ever seen. Next. Next, please. Or maybe that's the end of the... Even dogs were heroes. Tampa's first war dog. So I'm showing this to a group, and a guy raises his hand. And he said, we donated our dog, our German Shepherd, for the war. He said, we were all crying at the station, and 3 weeks later, we get a letter back saying, your dog, please pick up your dog at the station. And there was a tag attached. Your dog is too mean for the war. I should add, by the way, as we end this, I didn't start UNC until spring semester, because the first semester I had a draft deferred job to train German Shepherds for Vietnam. I had been a psych major, and I had a lot of behavioral psych, but next, please. Next. That is a headline of headlines. August 15th, 1945. Paul Tibbets of Miami, Florida. I'll end it here. Paul Tibbets had entered the University of Florida in the 1930s, and his father said, you are going to become a doctor. He's very tyrannical. And he drops out of school. And he said, I want to join the Army. And the father was just furious. And the mother said, things will be all right. And on August the 5th, 1945, he's to fly the lead mission, dropping the first atomic bomb. And someone notices you don't have a name on your B-29 Super Fortress. And he remembered, my mom always told me things will be all right. And so he put Enola Gay, which was his mother's name. Good story. Do we have time for questions?
Gary, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. Why don't we're right at 2 o'clock. I'm fine. I think it'll be completely appropriate if we take a couple of questions and
or comment or family stories.
Anyone who has questions for Gary, please go ahead and ask.
Can I ask a question, Gary, here?
Of course. Of
Please.
course.
Tell me, what really intrigues me is that America didn't really want to get into the war. In 1939, 1940, strong anti-war movement. Somehow Roosevelt starts the draft in 1940, long before war. How in the world did he persuade a pacifist America to start conscripting on a major scale?
That is a great question. And it is baffling. You're absolutely right. There was overwhelming isolationist sentiment. We felt we got in World War I, we got burned, the Allies never paid us. Things were worse after we left in the war. Roosevelt would never have asked for a declaration of war, but Roosevelt really felt that the future of Western democracy rested upon France and Britain. But he realized that the American people were defiantly isolationist, if not neutral. And we were certainly sympathetic to the Anglo. It is a miracle he managed to do that. It's the first peacetime draft in American history. You're right, 1940. Claude Pepper of Florida cast the deciding vote. It was one vote. And when he came out of the old Capitol, a group called Women for Peace had strung an effigy of him from a tree named Claude Benedict Pepper. And the answer is Roosevelt was the master magician. He really was. He also got America to start preparing for war, not just the peacetime draft, but we loaned ships to Britain. We started building bases around Florida, the South, across America. Defense munitions increased. It is all because of Roosevelt. By the way, it's also good for the economy. Americans felt the war preparedness was helping the economy. We figured we could have it both ways. We could end the Great Depression, but not get in the war. Everything changed. You wonder, had Japan not bombed Pearl Harbor, whether America would ever have gotten into the war. I'm not sure we would have. And the world would be a very different place.
Right. How were all those deficits financed? I mean, we have all these controversies now about deficit financing, depression, and then the war. Where did this all money come from?
Well, we did have war bonds, but they were war bonds, a fraction of it. We did increase the income tax, but does this remind you of anything? We pass it along to our children and our grandchildren. World War II was just we left the war with a massive deficit, but one of the greatest things came out of World War II, which addressed your question. In 1944, I think we knew we were going to win the war, but it's going to take a long time. And politicians began worrying, what happens if the war ends suddenly and 12 million servicemen come back and immediately enter the economy? It's going to be 1920 all over again. We're going to have a recession. We're going to have very angry soldiers. Let's think about a safety valve. And the safety valve was probably the most brilliant piece of legislation, the GI Bill. It was called the Servicemen's Adjustment Act, but it provided, think of UNC. UNC overnight after the war was over was flooded with servicemen. New schools were built. And think about that. The third greatest man I ever knew was John E. Oreo from the faculty in Tampa. He said before the war, he wanted to be a truck driver. He becomes an esteemed professor of English because of the GI Bill. John E. Oreo goes to Columbia. He couldn't have gotten into a boarding school in 1944. But so the GI Bill, I mean, think about that. We're paying lawyers, physicians, engineers are paying a lot more in taxes. So we were getting back at that deficit, but it's an American it's an American migraine. How we finance wars and pass along the debt to our children.
What did it do for integration?
World War II, by the end of the war, when the war began, there had never been an African-American Marine. And in the Navy, only African-Americans served as mess attendants. By the end of the war, that had changed. There were Black Marines. There were some integrated units. You could probably but on the home front, let me give you one example. In Miami, Florida, almost at the end of the war, in the spring of 1945, Black ministers decide to have a wade-in, W-A-D-E-N. They go to a place called Virginia Beach, a white-only beach. And they wade up to their ankles, and the police arrived, And they're about to arrest them, and the police said, they're really not doing anything wrong. And you can make an argument the civil rights movement began in Florida at that moment, that African Americans who returned were also said, we're not going to take this again. So you have Medgar Evers is a World War II vet in Alabama. So from both the white end and the black end, the war does force an adjustment to race relations. It's going to take longer than it should have, but it's revolutionary in some ways. Think of Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson is in officers candidate school at a base in Louisiana, and a bus driver tells him on the base, get to the back of the bus, which was illegal, by the way. If you were on a base, you could ride anywhere. He's court-martialed, and he's acquitted. And Branch Rickey advanced Jackie Robinson to the Brooklyn Dodgers, he said, because he's a race man.
Gosh.
Gary, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your knowledge and your perspective on such a very important period in our history. We're grateful for your wisdom, for your knowledge, and for sharing that with us today. So on behalf of East Chapel Hill Rotary, we thank you. Folks, I wish you all a happy and safe weekend, and we will look forward to meeting again next week. My best to you all.